especially when we start talking about, websites as opposed to individual web pages. But if we were to look at most any page out there or site out there, there's distinct chunks to the page, pieces of the page that like go together. All right, and let's take a look at, just pull up some web page. Maybe. Let's pull up some web page. I don't know. Super Bowl's coming up, so we'll look at ESPN. If we were to look at this page, we'll notice that there's sort of chunks of the page that go together. All right? There's pieces of the page that go together. This kind of thing at the top, actually this whole thing at the top sort of goes together. This sort of forms a unit. This forms a unit. This is a section, and so on. All right? Now that's important for a couple reasons. First reason it's important is that we may likely want to style or get the appearance of certain sections have a common look. So for example, we might want everything in this section to have white text. All right? We haven't talked about style sheets yet, but when we will, we might want to keep a section looking the same. Secondly, it's sort of logically grouped together. So we want to treat it as a unit. All right? If we look at other web pages, we'll see the same thing. Let's see, what would another... I don't know why I thought of this. It's not particularly a good day to go here. But is there ever really a bad day to go here? All right. Again, we have a banner on the top with navigation. We have a couple of sort of sidebars here. And then we have sort of a footer at the end. So we have a header, we have a footer, we have a content area, and so on. So it's not uncommon to have that. And we have it for two reasons. First of all, we want to treat it like a unit. We want to group it together, and we want the browser to know, hey, this is a unit. All right? And our big page is made up of these several smaller chunks or pieces that we put together. Logically, that's the way a page is structured. And another implication of that is we may want some sort of consistent look of everything within that chunk to look a certain way, to have a certain color, a certain font, or whatever. All right? So what we're going to do today is look at some of the structural tags, the tags that allow us to define a section of the page or a chunk of the page, all right, and say this is this is a separate piece of the page, this is a separate piece of the page, this is a separate piece of the page. Now we're going to talk about how it used to be and how it is now, and then we'll talk a little bit about why this is important to know this. Why do we even bother needing to know how it used to be? All right. It used to be that there was only one tag that represented a section of the page. All right, or a chunk of the page, and that was the div tag. Div tag looks like this: start div, end div. Div stands for division. Think of a division or a section of the page, part of the page. So what you would do if you were creating a web page is the banner at the very top of your page you might have a div for. So you might have, a div with an H1 that would say my home page. . 'Cause 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 Then you might have another div for the navigation of the page. A set of links, and so on. Then you might have a div for the main content of the page. Then you might have a div for the footer of the page, where there's maybe some other links, a copyright notice, a contact us, and so on. So that's sort of how they used to do that. So there used to be just one tag that represented a section of the page, and that was a div. The developers of HTML noticed, though, that people have distinct sections that are pretty common. In other words, to say it's a section of the page, that's not as meaningful as to say, well, this section of the page represents the header of the page. This section of the page represents the navigation of the page. This section of the page represents an article on the page. All right? So what they did with HTML5 is they refined these structural tags. They took the one div tag and they made several tags for a specific purpose. A div is sort of a generic section. It can represent any section on the page. And in HTML 4. Whatever and earlier, it was the only tag for the section. 1 second. So, in HTML5, they've defined some specific tags that represent a specific section as opposed to this generic sort of container. And so here are what the tags are in HTML5. There is a header tag, all right, that would sort of represent like the banner of the page. So if we pull up something like this, this stuff might be in a header tag. All right? The stuff that's sort of at the top of the page. Whoops. This stuff up here. That might be the header. There is a nav tag, which is the navigation of the page. In other words, the main navigation, the main links. And again, this might be in a nav tag, right? Because that's the main navigation. There is a footer tag. And in our example here, this kind of stuff might be in the footer tag. You know, the copyright notice, contact information, and so on. Let's get to another page. All right. There can be an article tag. And in this example, this could be an article, or this actually could be two articles, depending on how you score it. All right? We'll come to that in a second. For many of these things, it's not as though there is only one right answer. All right? You can sometimes interpret and do things a little bit differently. So I could consider this one article with just a couple of pieces in it, or I could consider it two articles. Really, it's not, for some of the subtleties here, it's not like worth it to agonize and sit there and, oh, should it be this or that? You know, just pick one, all right? Now, this is not a navigation section, right? So you wouldn't make it a nav section, you wouldn't make it a header, but if you were to say I make this one article, or you say I make it two articles, then fine, I'm not going to argue either way. Another tag is a aside. And that is where there's some like additional information. You know, you see it a lot in books. Let's take a look at this. Not this book, however. Let's see if we have anything. Nah, I don't see it. Anything. This might be an example of like an aside. Like a sidebar. It's not like the main article, but it's some additional stuff. All right? Sometimes it might be related to the main article in some way. For example, you know, with the Super Bowl coming up, there might be an article talking about the game. Then there might be a side article relating to one of the players whose wife just had a baby or something. I don't know. Some sort of human interest side article that's related to the main story, but like not the same as the main story. So you can put that in an aside tag. All right, let's see. Which ones did I miss? There's a section tag. All right. In this example, we could probably make this either as an aside or a section. It's not really an article, so just more of a collection of blurbs. I really wouldn't even call that an aside, right? Because it's not really related to the main article. It's totally a brand new set of ideas, brand new set of thoughts. So I might very well put that in a section tag if I was doing this. All right, because this is a section of the page that's like announcements or whatever you'd want to say. All right. Lastly, we still have our friend the div tag. And the reason for this, again, is remember that it takes some time for browsers to sort of catch up with the language. All right? The specifications for these languages evolve. In other words, the HTML5 specification actually isn't 100% completely finalized. But yet, browser makers and web developers are using it, so browsers have to take into account, which means that browser makers aren't always caught up. In addition, given the way that this thing works, all right, like on this machine, running an earlier version of Internet Explorer doesn't really recognize HTML5 tags, all right? Most of the examples I talk about today, I'll be viewing pages using the Google Chrome browser, all right, because that does do HTML5. Now, how do you guarantee that your page displays correctly then, if some older browsers don't display it correct? Well, that's a bit of a challenge, all right? We'll talk about some things that you can do to make your pages work better, even on older browsers. There's a couple of little, they call them hacks, not like hacks like, you know, infiltrating a computer system, but like they're sort of like the duct tape of computer code, right? You know, they're maybe not the absolute perfect way to do it, but it gets the job done, all right? So you put these little snippets of code in that fixes some of the issues with older browsers. For today, at least, we'll be viewing the pages in Google Chrome. And I would suggest as you're developing these with HTML5, at least for now, focus on Google Chrome, and then later on we'll bring in some of the other browsers and talk about how to make your code compatible with other browsers. Partly because of this, though, the div still works. So again, you know, that way if you've developed a page that uses divs and not the HTML5 tags, it's not going to break if an HTML5 browser views it, or if you change your page to be coded in HTML5. All right, let's look at how we could use this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this page, all right? I'm going to start putting some of these tags into this page here, just to show you how they would work. So, I will put, since if we look at this, and again, we'll have to add some things, all right? If we look at this, okay, that's a valid point, all right? If we want this is obviously like the header of the page, right? And then again, we could say that I have 2 articles or I have 1 article. I'm going to say this is 1 article about equipment, all right? We don't really have navigation yet. We could add some navigation in there. We'll add some dummy navigation in a minute. Even though we don't have all the pages written, we'll pretend. All right? So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that H1 in the header tag. Now, I know this is confusing. All right? It might take a few times to really make the distinction in your mind. The header tag is different than the head tag. All right? The head tag is one of the 2 tags that's directly under the HTML tag. There's the head and there's the body. All right? The head tag contains information about the page. The header tag, all right, is part of the body, and think of it as like being a banner, the header, like you'd have on a newspaper, the masthead, that kind of information that's on the very top of the page. All right? So that's what the header tag does for us. So it's a little confusing, but again. And then that's different, again, from the H1s through H6s. H1 and H6 are logically that level of header in the hierarchy. Now, typically, you'll have H1s through H6s within your header tag. All right? But you could have other stuff as well. If I have my company logo, for example, I might have an image in there. All right? And I might have a heading that says the name of my company and a mission statement paragraph. So don't think of the header tag as containing just headings. All right? It can contain other stuff as well. So would you say that the tags we're talking about are more, more sectional related, and then the H tags are more? Yes. Okay. Yes. The question was the tags that we're talking about today related to sections or chunks of the page. Absolutely. All right. The H1s, that's an individual heading. An individual heading could appear really in any section. Right? You could have a heading inside your navigation to say, here's popular links. Here is links to our favorite other websites or whatever. So you could have headings really in any section, all right, H1 through H6, but the heading tag itself is one, or the header tag itself is one that shows the group of things that is considered to be a heading at the top of the page. All right, so yeah, that's a good observation. And again, it's a little confusing. I recognize that, but over time, you'll get it. Bring up another example here. That's true. And we still don't have a screen. It doesn't have the example that I thought it would. again, they have an example like of a header, main heading of the document. In this section we are discussing, and so on. All right. Now, one thing I mentioned before is not to agonize over like what something is. For example, I called this an article, all right? Because it seems like an article to me, a little blurb written about our camping equipment that we sell, all right? You could also make this a section, all right? You could say, well, this is a section of the page that talks about that. It's not an article. It's not important to split hairs, all right? So don't sit there. You have better things to do than that. Trust me. You know, there's going to be snow to shovel tonight probably, and Super Bowl this weekend, and all those kind of things. You have better things to do than to worry about, is this an article or is this a section? Whatever makes sense to you. And when you look at that, do you think article? Do you think section? Whichever one it is, make it that. And don't lose sleep over it. Question?
Does it work the same way with the H1? Like trying to figure out, should this be an H1, H2, double H1? Is it your judgment on that?
There is some judgment. The question was, what about H1 versus H2? Again,
I understand, but I mean like several H1s.
Yeah, what I think of is think of it in terms of like an outline. How do you visualize that? Are all of those on the same level? In which case, yeah, then it'd all be H1s. All right. Is one sort of a subtopic underneath that? If so, then make it an H2.
And you can have more than one. I thought you had to limit the number of H1s on per page.
No, not really. No. Not that I'm aware of. No. All right. So here we had, in fact, we already had in this example an article, and it just goes around the whole article. Now, within that article, there can be headers and paragraphs and so on and so forth. You actually could make this an H1 and an H2, again, gain your judgment, you know, and again, not necessarily essential to lose sleep over these things. Navigation is going to be our collection of links. And I'm going to navigation is typically thought of as a list of links. All right? So what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about there's a couple of tags that are used to create lists on your page. All right? And we'll talk about the difference between them, and then we'll see how they work. They work pretty much the same. There's two kinds of lists. There's an unordered and there's an ordered. An unordered would be where the sequence is more or less arbitrary. You know, list my favorite foods. You know, pizza, potato chips, Hershey's bars. All right? If I put them in that order, does that mean that pizza is better than Hershey bars? No, it's just the order I thought of them in. There's no like official ranking of my favorite foods, and number 1 is pizza, and 10 points behind is number 2, potato chips. All right? If, on the other hand, I was going to show the most populous states in the United States, and I had California, New York, Texas, that the order matters. All right? If I get that in the wrong order, I'm misleading you. All right? If I rearrange potato chips versus pizza, I'm not misleading you because I love them both. All right? If I put the states ranked in a different order, then I'm not putting them in the order that they should be if I'm supposed to be listing the most populous states. So that's an ordered list where the order is essential to the list. Where the order is not essential to the list, that's called an unordered list. Typically for navigation, you use an unordered list, right? Because the order of the links really doesn't matter. You could choose to put the links in other orders, and it wouldn't be that huge of a deal. If we look, for example, at MSN, they have news, entertainment, sports. Could they just as well had news, sports, entertainment? Yeah. All right. It doesn't really matter the order of that, you know. Okay. So, our nav section is included in a nav tag. And there can be other things in the nav tag as well. There could be headings to separate our links into groups or whatever. But typically there will at least be an unordered list of items. An unordered list is put in a UL tag. UL standing for unordered list. Each item that's part of that list is in an LI tag. LI meaning list item. Okay? Now, what can a list item be? Well, you can have a list of anything, right? I could have a list of paragraphs. I could have a list of images when we get to images. But for navigation, our list is probably going to be a list of links. So I can put in a link. And again, I haven't created these pages, so I'll just pretend. The links will show up regardless if the page is out there or not. All right. So, unordered list. We then have a list item. And again, because our navigation is going to be a set of links, each list item is going to consist of a link to something. All right. So if I have 5 links in my navigation for my page, I'll have 5 LIs. All right. You're not going to have a list item that isn't part of a list. So I can't have an LI outside of a UL or OL tag. All right. I simply have to specify what list this belongs to, and what list it belongs to you define with a UL or an OL. Question?
Yeah. So from a browser perspective, reading this, will it take an ordered list? Would it take an unordered list and just arbitrarily list it in any way that it wanted to? Why do you have to have? Why doesn't it just accept the order that you put something in? Why do you have to designate it as an ordered list and an unordered list?
Okay, this is probably better shown than explained.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so let me save it, and then we'll look at it. Right now it's listed as an unordered list. Okay? So when you display it as an unordered list, it will display it simply as a bulleted point list in whatever order you specified, getting to your point.
Okay.
All right? So by me saying unordered, it doesn't mean that the browser shuffles them and displays the list items in some arbitrary order. It still displays them in the order that you have it. The first LI is the first item. So you can pick the order that it appears in. When you define it as an unordered list, though, you're simply saying that, yeah, that order is just something I made up. It isn't something that's essential to the list. It's not like the population ranking. Well, I didn't make up the order of that, right? The Census Bureau tells me the order to put them in. But when I decide what links I'm going to have on my page, do I put news before sports? Do I put entertainment before sports? I made that choice. It's essentially an arbitrary choice. Therefore, it will honor whatever sequence I put it in. All right? Now, you may not like the bullet point next to the navigation. That's kind of ugly. We'll take care of that via CSS. You might not like the fact that these are stacked vertically. You might want your navigation to be horizontal. We'll take care of that via CSS. Again, you always want to use the proper HTML tags irrespective of the way that they look, because we can change the way that they look based on our CSS. Now, we haven't seen an example of that yet, but we will see examples of that very soon. Maybe by the end of class today, we'll start getting into CSS a bit. All right? Let's look at what an ordered list would be. Let's pretend that this was an ordered list. Maybe this is a list of the most visited pages on my site, for example. All right. The only difference between the two is if I define it as an ordered list, they get numbered. Now, that's a nice feature because if you're like ranking the states, you don't have to then put the number in yourself, you know. And gee, was Iowa 37th or 38th? I lost count. I don't know. Just make them LIs and it'll count them for you and number them. Then if you add something in the middle, it'll adjust the numbers for you automatically. You don't have to go in and renumber those. You know, if you get the latest census information and Iowa jumped 3 spots, you don't have to go in and revise a whole bunch of things. You can just move it in the position in the list and the numbering will be taken care of. Typically, though, the purpose that we're using it for here, for navigation, is unordered lists. Because, again, there might be some logical reason for it, but essentially the order that you put the links in is arbitrary. You decided the best optimal way to arrange those. So that is the navigation section. Now, you can actually get crazy with your with lists, all right? And you can use these lists for other things, not just for navigation. Like down here, maybe I could list the different kinds of backpacks I had, you know, and maybe with an image of them even. And you can actually go crazy and put links inside of, lists inside of list items. So you can have sort of like an indented list going down. My suggestion is typically just to try to keep things simple. All right. Sometimes your code gets very confusing if you do that. On the other hand, sometimes you have problems that lend themselves to some kind of more involved solution. So just know that when I look at this LI, I can put other stuff in there besides simply text and links. I can even put another list in there if I wanted to. Okay? So that's 3 of our structural tags. The header, which corresponds to the very top of the page, you know, sort of the banner. The nav, which corresponds to navigation. The article. Let's put a footer in here. And seems like this would make for a good footer. All right. Interesting thing is, notice as I'm adding these tags, it doesn't make it look any different. All right, that's kind of an interesting quirk. What it does do, though, is it really organizes our code. And it makes our code better because we can easily find things in it, and everything is really grouped together. And then when we get to displaying styles, we can get a very consistent look on our page based on these different sections. One thing that we often do in software development is try to do things to make our life easier when we have to go and change it. So if we look at this code, I can instantly see that's the navigation section because it's in a nav tag. All right. In addition, there's a lot more flexibility as far as going between desktop and mobile. If we define our HTML very specifically and put tags in there that really indicate what the things are, all right? The one thing I say is don't lie to your browser, all right? You could put the list of links in an article tag, and it would display correctly, but that's not really an article. And later on, as you make the transition maybe to a mobile device, you might want all your articles looking a certain way and all your navigation looking another way, and it'll mess you up. So the bottom line is use the tags for which they were intended. All right, and that'll make your life a lot easier in the long run. Now, if I was teaching this class prior to HTML5, the header, the nav, the article, and the footer would all be div tags. That would be the only difference. Each one of them would be div tags. And again, that's not quite as descriptive. That's why HTML5 is an enhancement. It gives you more flexibility because you can say specifically the purpose of certain common sections. All right? And if you have a section of your page that doesn't fit into one of those categories, you can still use the div or the section tag. Questions about any of this? All right. I would like to at least introduce basic CSS. All right? Because at a certain point, come on, how long can you look at web pages that look like this? All right? The early days of the web, when the web was inhabited strictly by scientists and mathematicians and professors and all that, that's what pages look like on the web. That's what all of them look like, you know. You can still pull up some old pages that are, written with very specific audiences in mind, academic folks and not marketing folks, all right, and they'll look like this, all right, and it's functional, right? I mean, it has all the information, but as we know, the appearance is important. It's important for a lot of reasons, all right. For example, if it's important both in terms of making it aesthetically pleasing, and it's also important in terms of making it more functional. For example, maybe I want this to really stand out, my contact information. All right? One way to make it stand out would be to have it be a different color. All right? That would be a way to make that stand out. So through CSS, I could apply a style rule to say, hey, this is what I want that to look like, and give it a different color. Then it would stand out more, and people would be able to see it. So we do things to control the appearance of the page, both to make it look nicer, but that's not even necessarily our only or our main goal. Our main goal is to make it functional. Why do books? If you look at your textbook, there'll be borders around things. There'll be bigger headlines. There'll be things maybe in a shaded background. Why do they do all those things? Well, to just keep your attention and to focus your attention and to logically separate the page into sections that you can tell at a glance what the structure of a page is. If we go back to MSN, let's say, I got to read this article, Raging Monkeys Hurt 7. I guess I feel bad for the 7 people hurt, but that is an intriguing headline, you have to admit. You could, and wow, this is acting slow. One thing I've heard designers say, graphic designers, is look at a page and blur your eyes. That's easy for me to do. Just taking out my glasses blurs my eyes. But if you do that, I can tell based on the colors and the way things are positioned, I can get an idea of the structure of the page even without seeing the details. In other words, believe it or not, I can't read any words on this page other than world news. All right? Yet, I know this is a navigation. All right? Why? Because the way that they've graphically set it out and set it apart from everything gives me that visual tip in a very nonverbal way. All right? My whole point of this is a lot of times when people talk about web design, they stress like making it look nice. And certainly that's a goal. Who wants an ugly looking web page? But adding images and adding colors and adding borders is more than just that. It can make it more functional as well. So that is a second part of web design. So, how do we do this? We've talked so far about putting these things in and just letting the browser decide based on its defaults how we're going to do it. We control the appearance of the page via our CSS code. Where does the CSS code go? Well, we're going to look at a couple of ways of where to put it. Today we'll just look at the first way. All right? And one way to do your CSS is to put a style tag in the head section of your page. Actually, most of the ways to put style on your page involves putting it in the head section, right? Because that's information about the page. All right? This style tag essentially tells a browser, we're no longer speaking HTML. We're speaking CSS. So everything between here and here is not going to be HTML code, but it's going to be CSS code. And what does that CSS code look like? Well, there's a lot of variations for it, but the most simple would look like this. I define an HTML tag. I can then, between these curly brackets or braces, specify a number of different style rules. For example, let's say I wanted to make the background of the page yellow and the text blue. All right? Keep in mind when I do these things, I'm doing a lot of times I'll pick the colors to be dramatic and make it obvious and visible. So we'll look at the art of choosing nice colors probably next time. All right? But I can say background yellow, color blue. Now let's break this down and analyze it. What appears before the braces, before the curly brackets, is called the selector. All right? What does a selector do? Well, it selects what on the page is going to get that style rule. All right? So in this case, everything in the body is going to get this style rule. Another way of saying it is the whole page is going to get this style rule. The whole page is going to have this style rule applied to it. All right? So, the body, everything in the body, and remember, based on our nesting, all of this code is in our body. Everything that we have here is in our body. So all that stuff is going to get the rule that's enclosed within these braces. What does our rule look like? And again, we'll see dozens of different rules, but all of them have the same format. They have the name of the attribute, the name of the characteristic that we want to change, a colon, and then the value for that attribute. We then have a semicolon, and then we can repeat and have another name of an attribute, a colon, and another value. So, what this is telling me is, what is the style rule for the body? The background of the page I want to be yellow. The color of the page I want to, or the color of the page, meaning the color of the text, I want to be blue. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, background and color, there's a list of predefined things that you can control. And there's a lot of them. And the reason I picked background and color initially is because that's like the easiest one to visualize, typically. And the values, there's a list of predefined values in here. So you can't put like anything in there. I couldn't type in like, well, a nice like orangey kind of yellow that, that sort of looks like a sunset. I can't do that. There's a predefined list of color names I can put in there. And a predefined way for any attribute to give values for it. But typically, if you're talking about the basic colors, the color name typically works. So in this case, background yellow will make the background of the page yellow, and color blue will make the text of the page blue. So I will go and save this, and now when I view it, I get a yellow page with blue text. All right? Yes?
When you're adding the color, so you're not using the number, how it used to be with the pound or the
You can use that as well. Yeah, you can use that as well. I just didn't want to talk about that right now. We'll talk about that next week. All right? There's a couple ways that you can give the color. Certain color names work, but then you can also specify a numeric value. That's sort of like mixing paint together, where you can get literally, one of millions of different kinds of colors. Now, one thing I want to do is I'm going to change this real quick to make the color of the page red. That is the text red. All right? Notice something that looks goofy. These things aren't red. Well, remember, the way your page looks is a combination of two things. What you specify in your CSS and the browser default. So in this case, the browser default took over for the color of the links. And if we want to change the color of links, we're going to have to change it via our CSS to override the browser default. You can override just about any browser default via your CSS. I can't think of a case of a browser default that you can't override. All right? And one of the things we'll do, just like part of the job of learning HTML is learning all the tags, the part of CSS that we're going to learn is, number one, what are the different kinds of selectors we can have? Because this is just the first kind of selector, the HTML tag. All right? There's other kinds of selectors that really allow us to fine-tune and point not to everything on the page, or not even to every paragraph, but point to one little thing on the page and make it look different, because for whatever reason we want that to stand out. The other thing that we're going to learn is we're going to learn all the different attributes, or many of the different attributes that you can set. So we're going to learn more selectors and more attributes and values. Now, any guesses? What if I wanted the H1s on this page to look different? What if I wanted the H1s to have a white background and black text? What do you suppose I would do? Yeah. Exactly. In other words, I don't want everything on the page to look a certain way. I want the H1s to look different. I want the backgrounds of these to be white and the color to be black. So the color of the text will be black, the background will be white. Again, the selector says what on the page gets the rule. All right? So everything in the body is going to be yellow background, red text, except for the H1s. That's going to have a white background and black text. And there we go. The H1 has a white background and black text. Now you might say to yourself, how did the browser know what to do with that H1? Because the H1 is still part of the body, so why didn't it get that style rule? Well, the more specific you define a style rule, the more impact it has, the more precedence it has. So for example, this is everything in the body. This is specifically defined for H1s. So the H1 is going to sort of overrule the style for the body. All right? Here's where it gets a little more involved. And here is sort of the cascading part of the cascading style rule. What if I get rid of this background on the H1? All right? And just say color black. What do you think is going to happen?
Yellow background, black text.
It'll be yellow background, black text. Why? Well, that H1 actually got its appearance from a combination of these two. We defined everything in the body has a background of yellow and a color of red. We defined H1s, though, we want to have a text color of black. We didn't say anything about the background color. Therefore, we don't overrule the body's background, and the body's background applies. So the body's background of yellow still applies because we didn't override it for this. So that's sort of the cascading part of cascading style sheets. All right? And over time, as you do these, it takes a little bit of pre-thought to develop a CSS in a good way that's simple and straightforward. But that's the cascading part. You can define, all right, attributes on several different rules, and any given thing on the page might take some attributes from one rule, some attributes from another, and some attributes from a third. All right? I just wanted to introduce it at this point to show that's sort of the cascading part of the style sheets.
So from an organizational standpoint, you really want to sort of think this through so that you're not turning switches on and off.
Absolutely. As you're developing this, again, one thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to develop a common style sheet for all your pages because you don't want the navigation to be green on one page and orange on another. All right? And we'll talk about how you can do that and put this in a separate file so that every page refers to the same file. We'll talk about that next week. I did want to introduce this. This is one thing I wish the book introduced a little bit early. They go a long time before they talk about CSS. I don't know if they've talked about it yet in the book or not, but I get impatient. So I wanted to at least introduce that for you. And that way, if you are if you're completing the assignments and completing them easily, you can start playing around with some of these things and start applying different styles to it and see what it does. Now, the best way to learn anything is to take something and what if I do this? What if I do that? Now, the good news, all right, is compared to students that are studying nuclear physics, all right, if you make a mistake, you're not going to blow anything up, right? At the worst, you're going to have an ugly color combination. All right? So it pays to experiment with this because you can't break the computer. You can't blow it up just by putting in a bad CSS rule. Worst thing that will happen is it won't look good. All right. Any questions at this point? All right. See you over in lab.